quote that good people are willing to disobey bad laws. And I think making psychedelics illegal is a bit silly and kind of treats people like infants. No, you can't change your mind with using these plants. It kind of does tend to infantilize adult humans, and I think we ought to have access to these things if they're used responsibly.
A month later, they're actually feeling a lot more empowered inside. They've received these insights, they've gone ahead and actioned them, and then they're feeling like a shift in their life. And then that's when the next kind of pieces of the puzzles of things to unpack in their filing cabinet of consciousness in a way begin to be unraveled. So it's valuable to kind of take the lead of the positive insights that people receive to bring them into their lives so that they can continue on their journey of improving their well-being and waking up in the morning and feeling joyous about their life.
A special interest of yours is the integration phase of a psychedelic experience. You've written a whole book here. I'll just give it a plug here. Psychedelic Integration Journal. Wonderful book, by the way. Beautifully embossed. This has actually been the most intelligent conversation I've ever had about psychedelics, and I've had many. So my guest for today's episode is a registered psychologist, a clinical hypnotherapist, and a published author with a special interest in providing support for people with psychedelic integration. She has spent time with Amazonian tribes, learning their methods of using plant medicine to invoke healing through non-ordinary states of consciousness, and is trained in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Welcome to the show, Allie Ackland ON.
Yes. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for accepting the invitation because we both have a strong interest in psychedelics, and I've attempted to have conversations like this before, and they can go anywhere. So I'm kind of excited for where it goes. And I've got questions, but quite often I don't even refer to them. But I just wanted to start with this what seems to be a renaissance of popular interest in psychedelics probably over the last decade. In the 60s we had, LSD, and then we probably didn't have much for a while. I think it kind of went underground. But over the last decade or so, this whole interest in psychedelics is really growing, and more people are coming to psychedelics. And I just wondered, from your perspective, where do you think this is going? What do you think is behind the renewed interest in psychedelics, and where do you think it's headed?
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote that I quite like. I think it's from Les Miserables that says, "No army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come." And I really feel that, it is a time that humanity is ready for change, and there's already a lot of changes that have happened. If we were just to consider the last 50 years and how the schooling system was even 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, children were being physically harmed in schools, and the systems with authority were really strong. Like, you just couldn't get away with the things that some of the kids do now. And because I work a lot in schools and classes, the kinds of ways that classes are set up now to really accommodate the needs of kids is vastly different. So basically, at this point in time, people are much more willing to speak for the things that they believe in, the things that they perceive to be problems, and they I think authority doesn't have as strong a foothold within humanity. And when I was young and I'd do school projects, there'd only be the Encyclopedia Britannica, so there was a very limited way that you could really create projects and provide information. So the availability of information for people out there in the world is so much. There's obviously infinite information really at the moment. It's just at a click of your fingertips. And so because of this, people they can't be shut down so easily. They can't, if they, for example, have a mental health problem, it's no longer that if you go to the doctor and they say that, or go to a therapist and they tell you have some sort of brain problem, that you just willingly believe that and go home. Like, most people would research that, or they would question that, or they'd look for other options, or they'd have conversations with friends that are also educated and can give them other ideas of things that would be possible. So, yeah, when things aren't working, people are more likely to look for answers, and if they just get a short answer that doesn't suit them, they're more likely to kind of explore more, and the information is available for them. So it means, the mental health at this point in time is really not great for a lot of, even if we're just to base it in Australia, there's a lot of people suffering, there's a lot of people struggling and waking up in the morning and not feeling great. Some of these people, they don't know why. They have good lives. There's, even compared to their friends and the people around them, but sometimes they wake up and they realize there's something going on. So then they seek help, and sometimes the therapies that are available at this point in time don't always provide the solutions for them, which is why in Australia, part of the reason why in Australia at this point in time, for some people they can access MDMA or psilocybin under restricted conditions, mainly if they have treatment-resistant depression or PTSD. But there are doors opening that are meaning that people are more able and increasingly more able to access things as there's more shifts and changes around the legalization and restrictions of psychedelics in Australia.
Oh, really well articulated and cohesive response to my question. So what I heard you say is that in these times, psychedelics can be seen as like a catalyst for change, and that in that there's a certain anti-authoritarian theme because psychedelics have been used for thousands of years, but they've got this resurgence. And I agree with you, in these times there are people suffering a lot with mental health, and I think that the therapies, the mainstream therapies that are available are quite limited. There's a lot going on politically. There's a lot of division in society at the moment, and I think people are looking for deeper meaning, potentially, other than what they can get through their own research. It's kind of like, I guess psychedelics are like you're doing your own inner research. You can go out there into encyclopedias and books and do university degrees and learn what other people think is going on, or you can turn inwards and maybe do your own inner research. And so potentially psychedelics provide an opportunity for people to catalyze change from within, and they are anti-authoritarian because most of them are illegal. And so to take psychedelics, I like that quote that good people are willing to disobey bad laws. And I think making psychedelics illegal is a bit silly and kind of treats people like infants. No, you can't change your mind with using these plants. It kind of does tend to infantilize adult humans, and I think we ought to have access to these things if they're used responsibly. I
think at this, it brings up, you made me consider a few things there. And one of the things that I really like about this as a therapeutic tool is that when people consume a psychedelic, they actually are allowing the mentorship of what's happening within their own minds to happen within their own mind. Because, if I see a client, if they come into the room, I'm only really guessing what's going on for them. I can, build a fairly reasonable map about what's happening for them, but the truth is I actually have no idea. Yep. And when they actually have something that they can use as a tool to navigate from within, it's like having the therapist in your own head.
I like that.
And you can also see the scenery. It's almost like turning a light on in a room that you've never turned the light on before. You can see what's going on in that room and what's happening in that space. And then there's a capacity to explore it. And only that individual really knows what that's like. Only them really know, what their pain feels like, what their heartache really is. The feelings that are associated is so individual, and I think that's where the power of these medicines as a therapeutic tool comes in, because if you're constantly going to therapists or you've tried 100 different things and it's not working, there's information missing from the story. There's pieces of the pie that aren't coming to the table, that mean that effective solutions are just not occurring for that individual.
Yeah, I think the most powerful thing around a therapeutic experience when it's between like a client and a practitioner is the ability of the practitioner to get the client's world, to empathise, to be able to hear what is going on for them. And I think that's what gets most of the healing done in a session, and the quality of the relationship and the trust and the rapport. And I think that sometimes, like you're saying, you have no idea what's really going on for the person, but through empathy you're attempting to get their world so that you can be useful to them.
Is that going to be a problem?
Maybe.
Do you want to wait?
There we go, there's a break. We've just got a bit of a storm overhead. We'll keep going. And I have this theory that sometimes we make a mistake when we outsource our mental health to a therapist, hoping or believing that they have the answers for us and that they are going to make us well. And certainly they can support that process, but I really believe that when we shift the responsibility onto ourselves for our own mental health and well-being, and then see that therapist as a support person in that, I think what we're willing to take responsibility for, I think we have the power to change. And if we think the psychologist or the psychiatrist is going to fix us, we tend to shift the responsibility for the healing onto somebody else. And I think that's a mistake. And I think this is where psychedelics do have a place, in that you take a psychedelic, you're using the psychedelic almost as the therapist, because it is opening you up to parts of yourself that you wouldn't normally have access to. And so you're doing inner work, and rather than looking for an answer from outside of yourself. But then I think in terms of the integration process, how do I make sense of the experience I just had? And that's where I think a well-trained and experienced therapist may help the person to be able to make sense of their experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, some people are, effective at managing a lot of their experiences, and then other people, particularly when you get into the zones of people that have more complex mental health going on, they've got, for lack of a better word, almost like a bit of a bully in their head that every day they're hearing these thoughts go round and round and round. And for some of those people that are more at risk of kind of destabilizing, I think it's really imperative actually for those people to gain integration support for their processes, so they can develop a healthy map of where to go, and what actions that they can take, and also accountability for their actions. You do see a lot of people when they engage with these kinds of experiences being on a high for a week and engaging in whatever insights have come through for them. It might be that they need to spend more time with their kids and exercise more, or heal their relationship with their father, and they might kind of engage with some things to get to a better, to basically do those things for a week or so, but then it can often drift off. And sometimes a therapist can also help someone be accountable for those things and remind them, hey, what is it that you're doing this week? I know that this was really important to you and it came through in your journey, and how is it that you're taking action on this?
Yeah.
And so there's also other things that are supportive for people to bring some of their energies and the insights that they received into their life more holistically, so that they begin valuing themselves more. They begin prioritizing the important things for them, and gaining the long-term benefits of sitting in a ceremony, not actually just doing it short-term.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think some people put too much weight on the psychedelic experience itself and think that that's going to do all the healing, when really quite often people do get insights within a psychedelic experience. And you're saying that in the integration phase, like a skilled therapist is acting as an accountability buddy and saying, look, you just went off and had this experience. Do you recall what insights you had? What needed to change in your life? What were you shown? What did you see? Have you acted on that? Have you put those things in place, or did you think that the journey itself was the healing? And quite often I think when I'm working with people in trauma therapy, it is when they take those calls to action or those insights that they got within the experience and put those into action in their life, that's when like a whole other half of the healing happens. Half of the healing might happen within the experience, but the other half happens when they take what they learned from that experience and incorporate into that life. Like they might say, oh, I saw that I'm drinking too much and I need to stop drinking, or I need to write a letter to my mother, or I need to call my ex and apologise for being a twat. And so I think the part of the integration phase is like holding people to account for putting those insights into action in their life too. And that's what you're saying is the integration phase.
Yeah, and it also helps people feel really empowered, because they're the kinds of things, exactly those things that you're saying. Once they take action on those, then, a month later, they're actually feeling a lot more empowered inside. They've received these insights, they've gone ahead and actioned them, and then they're feeling like a shift in their life. And then that's when the next kind of pieces of the puzzles of things to unpack in their filing cabinet of consciousness, in a way, begin to be unraveled. So, it's valuable to kind of take the lead of the positive insights that people receive to bring them into their lives so that they can continue on their journey of feeling better inside, because ultimately that's most of the time that's the reason why people, in certain settings anyway, access these therapeutic substances for the purpose of improving their well-being and waking up in the morning and feeling joyous about their life.
Yeah, people generally come to psychedelics. There's probably several reasons. Some of it's kind of psychedelic tourism, and I've tried everything else, so I want to try this. It's a bit recreational, but I think most people probably come because there's aspects of their life that aren't working, and they want to discover what that is, and they're looking for healing or insights or explanations or reasons, and they're hoping that they'll be revealed in these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and they can then take the lessons from that, and if they are able to integrate that experience, then they've dealt with that particular layer of trauma or whatever that impact that thing was having in their life. Say it was alcohol, and then they stopped drinking, but then they've stopped drinking, but they still have maybe problems in their relationship. Stopping the drinking's helped, but there are still other relationship problems, so they might come back because they got what they could from the first session. They might come back for another session and say, okay, now I want to look at aspects of my relationship that have nothing to do with alcohol, and then they might get insights about that, and then they need to integrate those. And so I've had many psychedelic experiences. There was always an intention that I was bringing. There was some aspect of my life that wasn't working that I wanted to work on, and then maybe I got that, and then I come for another experience because it's some other aspect of my life. Because we all were multi-layered, multi-dimensional beings. And so the integration phase then therefore becomes an important phase, because if you're not doing that, then all the ceremonies just kind of blend into one big experience while it's not being integrated or causing any functional change in how you're showing up in life.
Yeah, that's true. And you do see that sometimes, people that are engaging with a lot of these processes, but they might talk about the insights that they receive, but then a month later they're the same insights because they haven't actually actioned them. And that can be a problem too. And in the psychedelic assisted therapy training they talked about that as if processing one photo over another, and it can be a bit like that. You can end up feeling a bit lost if you don't take accountability for some of those things that you receive, process them well in a healthy way, so then you can consider the process of deepening your exploration of yourself and unpacking those layers. Yeah.
I love that analogy, the double exposed photo. Yeah, like two experiences, and it gets confusing. Whereas if you integrate each experience in turn, in order, in a chronological order, that's a better way of approaching this kind of work, rather than just going and doing a whole bunch of sessions and hoping for the best.
Yeah, and it also, you're expressing to yourself that you value it more. And when you're expressing to yourself, same thing why, you know, people preparing for these kinds of experiences is also really important, because if you prepare well, you're expressing to yourself that you care and you value this experience. Your intentions are stronger, and your, you know, mindset around it is stronger. So it means that you're more likely to kind of value the information you receive and take a healthy approach to, you know, being present with your experience, integrating it healthy afterwards. You know, it does play a big role in being able to generate healthy experiences and valuable insights, and making the shifts and changes that you're wanting to make in your life, that ultimately for a lot of people are the reason they're there in the first place.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's you that have to make the changes in your life, and the psychedelic experience is really showing up as a teacher, or showing you where to make the changes. And unless you make the changes, you're going to remain where you are.
Yeah. And if you go to a teacher and the teacher tells you that you know, need to get up and meditate in the morning, and then you go back the next week and the teacher tells you that again, it gets to the point where the teacher stops telling you,
yes.
you know, and you miss out on that mentorship in the same way. It changes the nature of the relationship a bit as well.
Yeah, you made a comment earlier about people having unstable mental health or something along those lines, and there's lots of different mental health conditions, some more severe than others. The more severe ones are like, you know, really paranoid, schizophrenic conditions, or, you know, major bipolar depressive disorder, and then there's like cluster B personality types, and then there's more minor ones, depression, anxiety, ones that are kind of more treatable. Psychedelics aren't really for everybody, are they? What do you think in regards to this? Because some people think that it's fine for anyone with a mental health problem, and because some people with mental health problems think maybe psychedelics are the answer for them. I think, from my understanding, is that MAPS or people that are providing these psychedelic assisted therapy sessions exclude people with certain major diagnoses, and I imagine there's a good reason for that, but then include maybe people with more minor conditions that would respond well to it. I do know there was a guy, an acquaintance of mine, who suffered from bipolar, and he did many ayahuasca journeys, and he even took a bunch of tribal elders to the UN to get the psychedelics recognised as treatment for bipolar. So I don't know if you're aware of that, but what conditions, you know, that psychedelics aren't for everybody. So do you want to just speak to that?
I think that's a really valid point to bring up, which is why, you know, in Australia, with what's happened here, you need to go to a specific psychiatrist that's been approved by the TGA as being able to provide this therapy. And so they've obviously have a strong understanding of who meets the criteria to get in. Yep. But then actually when a lot of these people do get in to the therapy, there's, you know, there'd be a large percentage of those that actually end up being ineligible on the basis of some of the other comorbidities they have. And so, yeah, it's definitely recommended to see one of those psychiatrists if you're considering, for example, going overseas and accessing them in a space legally where they you're engaged with the culture, or different countries overseas, to check in with someone like a psychiatrist that's trained in that area, so that they can assess where you're at with your mental health. And it's definitely true that sometimes it can exacerbate certain mental health issues, things like psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, you know, and it's hard in some ways to kind of close a door to that, because, you know, for some people that have these conditions, it's challenging to hear that maybe it may not be for you, but obviously the main intention around that is that, you don't want to make symptoms worse. You want to improve them. And, there are other therapies that are potentially more beneficial for them until they get to a point where some of those other things have subsided, some of the other things with their condition have subsided. And there are still research studies that look into different specific diagnoses, like some of the ones you mentioned. So I wouldn't say that it's a closed door platform forever. I'd say that at this point in time, there's a lot of cautiousness around, especially in Australia, which is the first country to allow them to be approved therapeutically for people, to make sure that, and the same thing in studies as well, make sure that we are not putting ourselves in a position where we're exacerbating any problems for people, and choosing people that really do need help, but they are of a solid mindset and level of emotional health that it's much more likely that it's going to be highly beneficial for them.
Yeah, I think if people are seeking this through those channels, the legal channels, they have that safety net of being assessed by a psychiatrist before the medicine's even prescribed. That's a small tip of the iceberg of people who are coming to psychedelics, and I think most people are accessing their psychedelics in the underground scene, and where that safety net of being properly assessed for mental health conditions may or may not be there. And so my understanding is people with, say, schizophrenia, severe bipolar, even severe OCD, these conditions, that those people, there's a high risk of it exacerbating their conditions, and so those people, I believe, ought to maybe look elsewhere for help and support, and that psychedelics may actually be a risk to their safety, because people's safety is what needs to be valued over and above everything. And so if people are listening to this and think, psychedelics are going to cure me or help me with my mental illness, that's not necessarily the case. Did you ever, in your psychedelic assisted training, were there specific conditions that they mentioned that people with those conditions should avoid psychedelic experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I did mention a few of those before, but I didn't mention things like certain personality disorders, like borderline, and I think really just going back to what you were saying about some of the underground work, you can't rely anywhere really. I guess in Australia, you can't rely on the facilitators or the facilitator team to assess your mental health. You have to know for yourself whether this is something that is going to be likely to be beneficial for you. So that's why it's probably good to do your own research. If you have any a mental health condition that might mean that it's a potential risk and you're engaged with some of these processes, I would say it's really important to go and undertake your own assessment, so that you can feel confident when you go into that space. I have heard of some spaces where they do thoroughly assess people, but it's definitely not always the case.
Ultimately, the responsibility is on the person seeking the psychedelic experience to take self-responsibility for their own mental health, and that there are risks involved. That kind of leads into my next question. So Carl Jung cautioned against psychedelics, referring to them as unearned wisdom. I think I know what he was meaning by that. And there are, what do you see as the promises and the pitfalls of psychedelic therapy? Because there are a lot of promises, but there are also pitfalls, and people can get into difficult situations through taking this route, but there's also a lot of promises. How do you see the promises and the potential pitfalls?
Yeah, I think that within the space there does seem to be a lot of people that kind of fly the flag high in terms of the impact that it'll have in a positive way on people. And it's not to say that that isn't something that's likely to happen. Some of the things that people suggest, but you can't be blindsided to that and avoid the risk assessments with people, or avoid situations where maybe things didn't go well for people and not being able to support them. I also do some bad trip integration for people, and I guess this is an area where often if people haven't prepared well, the main things really, I guess, there is someone doesn't really feel safe within their own mind, or they're not feeling safe in the environment, or they're not feeling safe with who they're with, whether that's that they've gone out on a Saturday night to the pub and someone's offered some mushrooms and they've had some, and then suddenly they find themselves in a very difficult portal of fear. Or even in other settings, maybe where there is a bit more of a therapeutic environment and they're not feeling complete trust with the facilitator or the person that they're with. Sometimes that can also be a time that they spin into these fear-orientated feelings that often tend to perpetuate a difficult journey. So sometimes when people roll into those difficult journeys, it can be important for them to kind of coach themselves into, at the time, to try and coach themselves into trust and coach themselves into feeling safe or relying on themselves and their own consciousness and their own ability to navigate where they're at from within their own mind. But some people might suggest that bad trips can be therapeutic, and I think that it's true that a lot of people, I guess that my main focus with working with some of the people that come for integration therapy around bad trip experiences is to really pull the kind of juice out of the experience in terms of what the fears were for them, what was triggered for them, understanding kind of why it happened, but then finding the layers of that fear to earlier parts of their life, whether they had a big fear around the trust of others, and then they remember as a child they have had fear of, they were bullied at school or something like that, which is the deeper kind of experiences to work on, which is potentially the layers where some of these journeys kind of spin because the person already carries a bit of that fear story. So bad trip experiences aren't always things that are detrimental. The most detrimental thing is actually if people don't get help when they have these kinds of experiences and they land in a really unintegrated, difficult land of confusion and stress. They don't know where to turn. They don't seek help, and they just kind of ruminate about it. That can be one of the most challenging spaces for people, and also because of their decisions sometimes weren't legal decisions, they can also feel anxious that they can't necessarily seek help, and that can also be another barrier to them repairing. But a lot of the time, people can get to a place where they even value the experience that they had because it sent them on a bit of a journey where they were able to repair and restore deeper parts of their consciousness from earlier in their life, and where they arrived after processing all of that was a much better place than where they would have been otherwise.
Yeah. So so one of the pitfalls, well, it's not really a pitfall because you're saying there can be a benefit to it. One potential pitfall of a psychedelic experience is what some people refer to as a bad trip. And you're saying that bad trips can be therapeutic if they're managed well and integrated well. And that one of the barriers to that is if you've gone into the illegal underground market, you might not seek help. I have this idea that because a lot of people come to psychedelics to heal their traumas, past traumas, complex PTSD from childhood or episodic PTSD from being a war veteran or something like this. And I think the people looking to heal their trauma, my personal opinion is that they're better off using MDMA than going to something like ayahuasca or mushrooms or LSD. And I've got reasons for thinking that because I think that MDMA is not a psychedelic. It's actually, it's in a class of its own. Some people refer to it as an entactogen or an empathogen, but it's not strictly a psychedelic. And the difference for me is that psychedelics do disturb the ego. like you're not your normal self when you're on a psychedelic. It opens you up to imaginal realms, spirit guides, mystical visions, all sorts of content that's not present in an MDMA experience. So there's the disturbing of the ego, and then there's the content of the experience. You don't get that with MDMA, so it doesn't really qualify for me as a psychedelic. MDMA, I think, is the gold standard in treating trauma, particularly PTSD, complex PTSD. And it works differently because it's basically just turning the amygdala off, the body's threat detection system. But it's also giving you access to stuff that you've locked away in your subconscious. And so if MDMA is the gold standard, the other thing about the psychedelic that's different to MDMA is that a psychedelic will and can push you into a trauma that you're going to relive, whether you want to relive it or not. And I've witnessed this in psychedelic journeys where people might be on a 3-hour reliving of a traumatic experience, and they didn't want that. That wasn't their intention, and it's a very uncomfortable and painful experience for them. That could be referred to as a bad trip. With MDMA, that doesn't happen. People don't re-experience traumas in MDMA, and so my suggestion is to people who have lots of trauma that they go to MDMA to heal their trauma, and then if they're wanting to go to psychedelics after you've dealt with the trauma. That's just my personal opinion. What do you have to say in response to that?
The only thing I'll say, I think in Australia, the downscheduling for MDMA is that people have PTSD. So at the moment, in the work that's going on, usually people do have traumas that they're kind of encouraged to view. They're encouraged to, because the main thing with PTSD is that there's a trauma that usually there's a stack of early traumas, and there's an overarching trauma that's the more recent one, like maybe they had a car accident, and there's usually a repetitive theme, like the theme of I can't trust the world or something, for example, or I'm not safe. Yep. And then they find these layers in the earlier parts of their life. But people in the MDMA therapy are actually encouraged to view these traumas in that space. But because you're in a more heightened state, Bill Richards summarizes this quite well, where he says that MDMA opens the heart chakra, and you could say LSD, ayahuasca, and mushrooms, and potentially toad, the 5-MeO-DMT, all do the same thing. They have a very similar kind of effect on the brain in terms of opening. Bill Richards said, opens the crown chakra. So effectively, what you have with the second lot that I mentioned is that they're much more spiritually orientated. So you're kind of navigating more the spiritual aspects of the self and the psyche. Whereas the MDMA is more heart-opening, and you get the impact on the serotonin. So the reason why it's utilized for PTSD is because if someone's in a heightened state of love, it's much easier for them to view a trauma, and they can view the intensity of a trauma that for some people they might not even be able to talk about. They might not even be able to visualize without crying. So often there's a lot of avoidance around that specific trauma, but because they're in that heightened state, effectively a heightened state of love, they're able to consider it from a new angle. They're able to maybe interpret the meaning of the event. They're able to consider what lessons did they learn, and they're able, maybe even if they're just able to process a little piece more of that event, it brings them streets ahead of someone that is unable to even talk about it, So they are very different, and I do agree that for somebody that's had a lot of trauma, you may be better off cleansing some of the emotion from those traumas by having MDMA in a therapeutic environment than opening up your mind more spiritually and your consciousness more spiritually, where some of the fears associated with that, like you're saying, some of the heavy emotions associated with that may not necessarily be the best choice because the nature of some of the imagery or the nature of some of the it depends on the extent of the trauma. But at this point in time, I get that is part of the reason why the PTSD was approved for MDMA.
Yeah. I think it's a wonderful medicine for treating trauma. I think it's very effective. That's certainly what the research MAPS have done shows. Something like 80% effective against PTSD with veterans. And so I think it's the gold standard for trauma. And so that's why I think if people come to me for advice around that, I say, look, if you're looking to deal with trauma, I think MDMA is the better option. If you don't have a lot of trauma, then sure, psychedelics, you might find that safer. But I just have witnessed people have horrible revisions of their deep traumas without any healing involved in a psychedelic experience, and they're left quite traumatized by it or re-traumatized. Do you think how do they address that in terms of the training? Do they say that people can be re-traumatized, or the psychedelic assisted training you're doing is mushrooms, so psilocybin and MDMA?
Yeah, it was mainly focused on that and ketamine.
And ketamine, okay. So not things like ayahuasca.
No.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. But like I said, those ones, some there's a very similar impact on the brain in terms of, turning the volume of your identity down and having the flushing. I don't know if everyone's seen that picture of all of the coloured lines, and you can see your mind on psilocybin compared to not being. It's basically the 7 core regions of the brain and showing the flushing of communication between the parts of the brain. So on a basic level, those LSD, DMT, and psilocybin all do have a very similar effect on the brain in that way, whereas other psychedelics are quite different. Yeah,
so they're turning the default mode network off, which is basically your sense of self or your identity, or how we tend to view the world or interact or interrelate or interface with the world through our default mode. And so the psychedelics turn that down, and so your sense of self or identity or ego is somewhat diminished or dissolved. And this is what I think happens with psychedelics, is that it does bring about a dissolution of ego. And we had this conversation before we started, that my interpretation of the main benefit I got from my psychedelic experiences was that it showed me that I'm not just my ego or my persona, because that gets dialed down when the default mode network's deactivated. And so what's behind the mask of the persona or the ego comes through, and Jung referred to this as the shadow. And so I was really intrigued by that concept and have spent the last decade using psychedelics to explore my shadow. Not my ego or my identity, but the things that were behind that. And so when we take a psychedelic, I think some of these bad trip experiences are really aspects of our shadow revealing themselves. And then most of us, if we have an aspect of our shadow reveal itself, we run from it, or we're terrified of it, or we go into this like fear response you were talking about. And that's a feature of bad trip experiences. It can be really quite terrifying. Then you're kind of in a fight-flight response. I think there's that brings me to the question that the other thing we talked about before we started was and you've got it in your book, which I think is awesome, the difference in interpretation between what psychedelic actually means, because I think there's at least 2 interpretations. One is psyche being mind, and delia or delos meaning manifesting. So, and I don't particularly agree with this interpretation, that psychedelics are mind manifesting. Psyche, in my opinion, and yours too, refers to soul, and I think there's a big difference between soul and mind, and that delia or delos refers to revealing. So I think that a psychedelic is not mind manifesting, but soul revealing. And so in my opinion, when I have a psychedelic and my ego diffuses and my shadow shines through, I'm now seeing a more complete version of myself. I'm seeing the 2 disparate parts of self, ego and shadow. And for me, that's an opportunity to integrate those 2 parts of self. And I think the ego and the shadow are part of my soul, and that's what's being revealed. Because mind manifesting I think it's a bit misleading, because I think a lot of people are under misunderstanding that when you take a psychedelic, it's causing increased activity in areas of the mind and a manifestation of mind. But, the research shows that actually it's dampening down. It's actually, down regulating a lot of the parts of your mind. And so maybe what's behind our sense of self or our default mode is a deeper aspect of self, our spirit self, our soul, these other things. Once I start on these conversations, I get to where it's like it gets harder and harder to form a coherent, articulate description of what I'm trying to describe.
Yeah, I mean, I could say that it's kind of like when you wake up in the morning and for a moment you've forgotten who you are. You're in the middle of a dream, and then that moment where it floods to you. Oh, that's right. This is who I am. This is my house. This is, you kind of have that split second where you almost forget who you are. And the you don't get to the point where you lose complete awareness of yourself as the awareness that you are, but it's like turning down the volume of the story of you, and then because that happens, you're more flexible, and your mind is able to consider new things, and actually even on a sensory level, because it actually affects the sensory part of the brain as well, able to be more open to experiencing more open sensory information. Like you might see the energy around a tree, you might even closing your eyes and seeing all the visions that you experience. So because you don't have such a solid structure on who you are and the volume of that is turned down, it does allow for like a flushing of different parts of the brain to communicate in new ways and in new patterns, and that allows for more flexibility. There's the brain just doesn't communicate in those patterns and in those ways generally. So what happens afterwards is you end up being more open, and people would notice this particularly in the few days afterwards, more kind of suggestible to ideas. They can go into kind of like those dreamy kind of open spaces, and it's such a therapeutic space, especially for people that have a lot of anxiety and they have a lot of ruminating thoughts and the same thoughts going round and round every day. It really allows for an altered state to occur so that they can feel something new and allow some of these, like you're saying, the parts of the soul, the parts of the psyche, allow some of those parts that are, potentially emotional layers with heavy emotion to come to the surface so that people can feel more liberated, they can feel more open, they can have more clarity, they can have a more open view of, themselves and the world, and, that can transcend into people experiencing higher levels of well-being. We definitely know that with the mystical experiences scale, there is an association with people having more mystical experiences, or the ratings on that scale, and improved well-being afterwards. So I guess it's reflective of actually allowing someone's mind to change state into experiencing something radically new can actually support them to be open to creating more new things. And often those new things with good support can allow for a better life for them, can allow for a life with potentially more positive changes.
I think psychedelics definitely open our mind up to different experiences. And if you come to psychedelics looking for therapeutic change or whatever, then you may encounter repressed memories, and some of those may be painful and traumas. And some people say, well, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to go and experience, or wouldn't you be better off just forgetting about all that, right? There are people that think that way, and they would, of course, never come to psychedelics. But there are people who don't want to remember the past. There's people who are quite closed-minded and happy to be I'm just going to get on with it. Personally, I don't agree with that. I think we're much better off facing the things that we're running from, or that we're hiding, or our repressed hurts or memories or traumas. I think it's way better to open up to that stuff, work through that stuff in a healthy way and integrate that. But not everybody thinks that way. I've talked to people and they're like, why would you want to go and remember all the painful things that happened to you in your childhood and your traumas, and dig in all that emotional stuff? And there's, I think you could make a valid case for either of those ways of looking at it. But I because I'm, a counsellor and a therapist, I think there's a lot, and in my own personal experience, me going back and digging in all that dirt and all that pain, it's been very therapeutic and very helpful and transformational in my life. But in terms of open-mindedness, there's a big spectrum of how open people's mind are. It's one of the 5 personality traits that they can measure. And so I think people who are really open-minded are the ones that probably are more likely to come to psychedelic experiences, and people who are maybe more closed-minded. Do you think if they're right down that other end of the spectrum of closed-minded, one, they're probably not going to come to the psychedelic experience. But if they did, do you think they would have a different experience?
It's interesting because I know that they thought that openness was actually a stable personality trait. They thought personality in general was quite stable over time. But when people do engage in psychedelic use, openness is the one area that actually does tend to shift people. People tend, I mean, you can't say they definitely tend to become more open, but it's actually something that can shift and change the openness of people. I think if you develop a story that you're going to experience something traumatic, and then that trauma might be re-traumatizing because you're going to have to relive it, for a lot of people, they would be in avoidance of wanting to experience that. But often with the therapeutic support that people would have, definitely in more of the therapeutic model that's coming through in Australia, the therapist would work with them to kind of unpack some of those traumas and sort of be aware of what they are beforehand. So they already have, maybe a sense of positive potential therapeutic change around them. And then when people do have either MDMA or psilocybin, I mean, a lot of people describe it as having like some people might refer to certain medicines as kind of like the mother or the grandmother, or you hear these words thrown around because it's like having a mentor on your head. So just because you're going to remember a trauma, it's likely that you're going to have this presence of love with you, or presence of warmth with you, or presence of a mentor with you when you're in that space. And sometimes that can be what leads you to unpack it in a healthy way, to witness the trauma but not necessarily be re-traumatized by it, but actually have the kind of threads of it unweaved in the perfect way so that you can develop a new story on that trauma. You can even just gain one new insight on that might be enough to kind of shift it or bring it up in conversation with your therapist afterwards. That allows for a whole nother trajectory to happen around the management of that trauma that effectively could lead them to the space where they can resolve it, they can release that emotion, they can step into, forgiveness of themselves, of the person, of the environment, and on the highest level get to the point where they're really glad they went through that trauma because they learned so much and it made them really strong as a person. And I guess that's the ideal space that people do arrive when they have been through really challenging things.
I think that's a great explanation of what's happening therapeutically within the psychedelic experience, is that, and Gabor Mate says this, and I think he's spot on, is that our trauma is not necessarily what happened to us, but what's happening inside of us now because of what happened. In other words, you have this traumatic event, but then you make a whole lot of meaning about that. There's something wrong with me. I can't trust men. I can't trust women. It's more the repercussions of the traumatic event itself that live on long after the traumatic event that are causing the problems in your life today, often decades after the event. And it's when you can correct those stories or those limiting beliefs that you created as a result of your trauma. And like you say, you've got this mentor in your head, but also if you've got a trained facilitator there who knows to look for these meanings or interpretations or stories that we created, these beliefs that we decided about ourselves because of the things that happened to us, then you can recreate those beliefs, those stories. And in that's therapeutic, because when you recreate those beliefs, your life, and change your mind, change your life. Is that
Yeah, that's right. And I think, for some people, just becoming aware of certain beliefs, if you think about people that are kind of really into affirmations and things like that, sometimes there are people that are really able to identify negative beliefs and just make a new decision to change them. And then there's people that actually benefit more from kind of diving into that memory, diving into those traumas and releasing kind of some of the emotions that are there, releasing the sadness, releasing the grief, and then getting to the point where they actually no longer believe that because the energy and the emotion isn't there anymore. So yeah, I think, which is why sometimes I think that CBT works for some people and it doesn't work for others. Some people just can't convince themselves of something when they, on a deeper level, they have a competing memory that tells them something new. So
I think the trauma can be stored in different ways. I see it as it's stored as a story or fantasy, like a memory, because our memories aren't perfect. There's the event that happened, and so there's a cognitive memory stored of the event. There's the emotional impact of the event, and then there's the body's reaction to that. And so when people have these psychedelic experiences and are discharging or working through trauma, that can be released through the retelling of the story and what they made that mean. That's one part of releasing that. And then people will often have emotional catharsis, might crying, yelling, screaming, fear, all these different emotional responses. And then you get people have just like a somatic and visceral release. It seems as though the traumas are laid down, not just in one way, but that there's different elements of them. And you're saying if it's just a cognitive thing, CBT might work, but for the more emotional types or embodied types, it's more releasing the somatic and the emotive parts.
Yeah, that's right. And and I guess forgiving as well, like just being able to genuinely surrender and release the moment that's causing the trauma. Like usually there's someone to blame.
Yeah, there is.
Usually it's themselves. Usually it's actually almost always themselves as well. I mean, yeah, often people, even if they blame someone else, they actually feel a little bit of guilt inside that actually maybe they shouldn't have been there, or develop some story around themselves as well. But yeah, I think,
Ralph Metzner, are you familiar with Ralph Metzner? He wrote a paper called MDMA Solo. It's a good read if you haven't read it. And he suggests that there shouldn't be a facilitator or practitioner in the room, that if you're going to do MDMA for your trauma, you should do it on your own. And he reckons the facilitator's only going to get in the way. I don't necessarily agree with that. And I've got this other theory that, like you just said, when a trauma happens, there's usually a person involved. There's usually another human there causing the trauma. So when we're healing our trauma, I think it's beneficial to have a human there witnessing the healing. And I think that helps us to make it more real and embody it. Do you have any thoughts on, whether psychedelic experiences are therapeutic with or without a facilitator?
I mean, there are definitely people that do, go and have these experiences on their own, but I'd say it's almost a bit like deciding to have a free birth at home. You never really know what's going to happen.
Right. Good analogy.
And you make this decision that you're feeling confident in a certain mindset, that you're going to be able to get the baby out and everything's going to be okay. But then sometimes things going to go to plan and you need help, but you don't just need help in a minute, you need help now. And some of those things might just be, there might be small things like I need a drink of water, I need help to go to the toilet, I need, some of the more physical, practical things. But other times, sometimes people can get stuck. They can get, they might have endless visions of, lizards for 2 hours and they just can't break out of that pattern. So sometimes you want that person there to be able to ask questions if you need support, if you need, you've got that helping hand, and especially for people that haven't gone into any kind of altered state before. It is a big jump, and I definitely am not supportive of people going off and doing these things on their own, because even for the people that have done these things a lot, you never really know what
you're getting yourself in for. Commonly, there's 3 stages to a psychedelic experience: the preparation, the initiation or the journey itself, and then the integration. I just want to speak about the preparation quite minimally. I mean, for me, that's just around vetting the person. Are they ready? Is this for them or not? But then whether or not you're working with an intention. And do you have any thoughts on whether, I think you mentioned it before, that you think people should have some idea of what they're wanting to work on, what traumas are they looking for healing with? Are they working on a specific intention? Or do you think it's also safe to go into a psychedelic experience? I'll just deal with whatever comes up and I don't have a specific intention. Do you have any thoughts around that in terms of preparation?
What came up for me initially when you were first talking is, I think that preparation is really, really valuable. And I think that, if you think about it at the most extreme end of lack of preparation, someone's at a party, someone maybe even had other things, someone passes something around and you think, sure, I'm going to have it. I guess that's a state of probably the least preparation you could go use, like a 5-second thought and you just agree with it. It can be true. And I guess it's less, I'm going to say it's less true for MDMA than it would be with something like mushrooms, because mushrooms or other psychedelics, you're going into an altered state of consciousness. It's kind of like it's kind of like on a train. If you want to jump too suddenly to another train and go in a completely different direction, it can be a shock for your system. It can spin you out. You're not actually prepared and ready for some of the variables that can happen in your life. Whereas if you go down to the more extreme end of thorough preparation, might be somebody that spends time processing some of their emotions with the therapist before they engage in some of these things, flag some of the traumas that they have in their life that might come up, is able to spend a couple of weeks preparing themselves in terms of diet, like really, detoxing the body in terms of really eating healthy, wholesome foods, and, allowing their mind to be focused on positive things, exercising, clearing, not watching TV or reading the newspaper, things that are kind of bringing in data and information that isn't necessarily about them. And is only going to create stories in their head. So kind of purifying their mind, maybe meditating in the morning, and then really setting up a great space with their facilitator in terms of, feeling safe in the room, feeling like they have, even some pictures of some things that empower them there. They're feeling they've spent particularly the 3 days beforehand really valuing and considering what they would like to get out of it, and maybe setting some intentions, but also being free to kind of surrender them. They're going to have a very different experience to that person at the party. Sure. And what it can mean is if people don't prepare well, they can be more likely to end up in bad trip land. A bad trip land is where you need a lot of integration, where your experiences caused a challenge in your psyche to the point that you need significant regular help until you get to the other side of that. So you could argue that more preparation is more likely to lead to less integration. I think that would be a fair statement to make.
Yeah, great. That's awesome. I think we'll skip the initiation phase because that's you couldn't even deal with that in a podcast episode. But I want to move on to, I think, a special interest of yours is the integration phase of a psychedelic experience. You've written a whole book here. I'll just give it a plug here. Psychedelic Integration Journal. Wonderful book, by the way. Beautifully embossed, like real quality. They say you can't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, I think you can. I think the content of this book's really quality. I was really surprised by how well it's written and the different strategies that you have in there for people who have had psychedelic experiences and are looking to know how to integrate them properly. And there's lots of great tips in there. Can you give maybe just a summary, or you can go in deep as you want, like what do you see as the main ingredients of the integration phase of a psychedelic experience? And then can you give an example of maybe a client you've worked with who had maybe a bad trip and they needed help with integration, and what particular strategy might have made a difference? So.
Did you say the main ingredient? Sorry.
Sorry, what are the tools or strategies that you've got in your book here that are the really helpful ones, the ones that do the heavy lifting in terms of integration?
Yeah, I think because you've gone into an altered state of mind, sometimes arriving back in your present reality of how things are is one where you've kind of been in like a portal of let's just say like a 5-hour experience where you've been in another state of mind, and then sometimes when you kind of land back, there can be some processes that support you to kind of build some bridges to that experience. So you may have experienced you just say you had visions of it could be I guess the thing that's good to consider is the moments where you had aha moments where you had new realizations, new insights, and they're positive insights, and they can be really important anchors to return to. So if you just say you had this aha moment where you realized your dad didn't love you as much as you thought, and that you remember one moment where you were particularly sad about this as a kid, when you're in that kind of altered state, and you arrive back in your present state, it can be good to bring your attention to that aha moment, to remember the moment, to envisage the feelings, and even to turn up the volume of those feelings and those visions. And now that you're in that more grounded state of mind, try and draw more from the experience. I've worked with people where they are really able to have whole things unpack from just sitting with that experience, that aha moment. They might get new thoughts. They might be aware of parts of their body that are feeling tension or stress, and they're able to kind of like breathe through them. They might experience kind of other memories and things that come to the surface. So it's because they've been in that altered state of mind, sometimes things can happen quite fast in that space, and you are in that altered state where you're not necessarily grounding the information. So returning to them, energizing them, and I must say that these are the positive aha moments, and drawing more from that can be really good, and they can be like the anchors that end up being the platform that somebody makes change from.
Yeah.
And usually that's something that would happen in the few days after they've had their experience, mainly because that's when the mind is in the most level of flexibility. So if someone was to return to like an image like that, they might be more likely to cry. They might be more likely to release emotion because they're in that their mind is more flexible. And then beyond that, I think it's really great that people can do all different kinds of things to integrate physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So they might set up new kind of spiritual rituals where they light a candle in the morning and say a prayer for their family or for themselves. They might engage in physical things like exercising, spending more time in nature. It does tend to be a lot of people do find that spending time in nature is quite therapeutic. Being in that can support them to kind of emotionally regulate and clear some of their thoughts from their mind. So taking action, doing things to help themselves physically. Mentally, you might want to educate yourself, spend time looking at because there can be things that come up in people's experience too that don't make any sense. They might get a vision of the pyramids and they think, why do you get a vision of the pyramids? And they just let it go. But it's actually an opportunity to kind of go and research that. Okay, why don't you go and look at the pyramids? Why don't you go and gain some information about that? And sometimes that takes them on a whole nother journey of their life. There's just one moment of something that pops through. So I do have a list of like 50 things or something in there that people can do to continue to expand, because they've gone through an expansive process and then they want to continue to expand in their life and make their life more whole.
And it is a journal, so I guess journaling is also one of the key to journal your experience, to write about. Do you think it's a good strategy shortly after experience to journal the next day? Should you? Yeah. Is it worthwhile to try and capture as much as you can recall down on paper? And read it later? Is that helpful?
Yeah, I feel that. I think you don't have to write full sentences, but sometimes you just make dot points because people do forget things quite quickly within a couple of days, and there can be certain memories that they can't remember at all. So the whole point in the journal is for people to be able to kind of write down everything that they have experienced, like I said, even if it's just words, or draw images as well. And then from there, that information, they can reflect on that weeks later. The benefits of a journal is that somebody can look at it a week later, they can look at it a year later, they can look at it 2 years later. Sometimes, even some of the experiences I've had years later, things have clicked into place that have made sense for journeys much prior. So it can be really helpful to have a record of those things so that they have the capacity to remember, and then I guess it's like having a big puzzle, and when you engage in these experiences, you almost like rip parts of the puzzle apart, or you maybe it's more fair to say that you pick up pieces of the puzzle and you study them from new directions, and then you're trying to put these puzzle pieces back. And whilst you're doing that, there's certain things that you can do to make sure that you have a much more thorough understanding of the tapestry or the puzzle of your life, and develop a much deeper understanding of your psyche, consciousness, and the picture that makes up you.
One of my least favourite integration strategies with ayahuasca journeys is the talking stick ceremony that happens after the next morning. I don't know, that I always found that a bit tough for me, because the last thing I want to do the next day and that morning is sit around and listen to 20 people's other experiences. I mean, I don't mean that to be ignorant. I just mean that that's not particularly what I'm wanting in terms of an integration experience. Some people say one or two things and hand the talking stick along, and then someone might take up 20 minutes of your day, and which may be helpful to them, but of no benefit to me really, even though we went through that journey together. So that I'm not a big fan of the talking circle afterwards myself. And I mean, you've been to the Amazon, I've been there too, and sat with shamans in there. There's no preparation, there's no integration, there's just initiation. It's really quite a different way of doing it. And so some of my favourite journeys and experiences with psychedelics were in the jungle in Peru, where the guy facilitating doesn't even speak English. He's talking in Spanish, and you're hoping you're understanding. He's got a translator there for some things, and it's a lot more raw and real. And I think they were some of my more powerful experiences too. So, but I do think that in our more Western approach, or therapeutic or psychedelic assisted therapy approach, I think that we don't have that. We're not shamans. We don't have a long lineage of training and all the rest of it. And so they've got their more organic ways of doing things, whereas I think the way we're setting it up here is, I think, preparation, integration are very important.
And I guess because they live in a context of a community, they already live in a container of life where there's certain processes. I mean, particularly for some of the tribes that I went to, where they hunt their own food every day. They rarely go to town. It's like an 8-hour boat ride. And so when they engage with these processes, they kind of bring them back into the community, but they're not necessarily, there might be the things that come up for them, maybe their childhood experiences, but then they have their family around them, they have the people around them to support them, they have the nature there. Then they're not necessarily going to. Yeah, I mean,
that's a good point. It's not like they're running off to their job the next day. They're 9 to 5. It's that they are integrating. They just have their own way of doing it,
and they already have a kind of complete life. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but they have a holistic life where they're there with their family, with their friends, community. They have all their needs met. They're not necessarily seeking other things. They're not necessarily seeking to be entrepreneurs and go and make a lot of money or whatever. So they don't have the same dimensions of variability in their life of desires and wishes. And they already live in a fairly complete. And sometimes I feel like certain medicines do push people in that direction of community, and they push people in the direction of time in nature and a holistic life where people are, valuing where their food comes from, maybe even growing their own food. So maybe they are where maybe some of the psychedelics want to push us already, so therefore they don't need as much integration. I'm not sure.
With particularly troublesome psychedelic experiences or bad trip experiences, one of the outcomes of that can be people can be left in quite a dissociative state, or there's different types of dissociative states. In your practice as a psychologist with people coming to you for psychedelic integration, have you dealt with anyone who's been in a particularly troubled or dissociative state post a psychedelic experience? And if so, do you have methods or strategies or support to help them through that so that they are able to manage those? I've certainly had a dissociative state experience from a bad trip. I don't like to call them bad trip experiences, but I actually had a psychotic break inside an ayahuasca ceremony, and I was quite dissociated for many months. And I was looking for help everywhere, and I eventually got it through MDMA therapy. I saw an underground practitioner and got my healing.
Really?
It actually helped
integrate.
Yeah, it really did. It showed me what I needed to see. And because a dissociative state is fight, flight, it's basically flight, fight, flight or freeze. And because the psychotic experience was a traumatic event, and I think I froze and ended up in quite it was almost hard to function with that level of dissociation. I felt like my spirit was wanting to leave my body, on a daily basis. I'd be driving my car and I thought I was going to pass out, and I'd have to pull over while driving some of the times because I would start to leave my body. And so do you have any examples of having worked with people where they ended up not necessarily dissociative, but certainly in a bad way after a psychedelic experience, and through a process of integration, you were able to cause a good result for that person? Is there anyone who comes to mind that you've worked with?
I think one of the more common kinds of bad trip experiences is the depersonalization and the derealization, where you think that the world isn't real, or even you're not real, and you can be like you're watching yourself from above yourself. Or maybe you just get flits of that during the day. And it's funny because they do say that it's a bit of a dance with people sometimes to unpack that state of mind, because people do generally get better over time, even if they're not to do that much. After a couple of years, often they do get better, and that's because with the depersonalization, the derealization, it can be good to not get too focused on it. So, I teach people to develop more of a mindfulness approach for when that feeling of derealization comes in, or when that feeling of depersonalization comes in, and value at the end of the day how well they get through those spurs of derealization or depersonalization. Because if you get too obsessed with it, then the fear that it's going to happen, because ultimately there's a fear it's going to happen, sometimes gets a little bit bigger. So
you put more attention on it.
It is a long road. Like it is a long road for people. And not always, but it depends on the situation. It depends on kind of, the pieces of the pie. There might be someone that feels like guilty, like ashamed, like they did the wrong thing. And it could be someone that, more blames somebody else in the situation. Right. So it's a different map for everyone. One of the trainers that I work with kind of teaches people to do this map of their bad trip, what the thoughts they were having at different trigger points, and when things kind of de-escalated. But one thing that I will just say there is that sometimes actually bad trip experiences don't trigger. Sometimes depersonalization, derealization rather, doesn't trigger for weeks afterwards. I know it's quite common with 5-MeO-DMT, or even I do have a client where it happened to them where they're 2 weeks later they were just listening to a podcast, and that podcast just triggered the depersonalization and the derealization. And so I think that's also something that's important to acknowledge, so that those people still, assess and consider what is happening for them and get relevant support for them. If I was thinking of somebody who, was heavily religious and was engaged in strict religion, and they decided at home that they were going to have some psychedelics by themselves and had no support around them, and did it a number of times. And then when they listened to that podcast in the future, that triggered this depersonalization and derealization. But there was a lot to unpack for this person. There was there was shame. There was kind of the religious
guilt
issues. The fact that, steered away from a religion and then experienced a bad consequence. Is it my fault? Is it, am I bad? Is it, there's a spiritual thing with, even you could say disobeying God, there can be some really deep, and we know that these substances as well do push people towards empowerment, and you could say even religious empowerment in some ways, because if you look at the Good Friday study, which is one of the reasons why psychedelics were pushed to be rapidly outlawed, that was a study where they looked at people's experience in a church on Good Friday, and they gave half the people psychedelics, half the people not, and then they got them to write out kind of their experience and removed all references to psychedelics, and then sent them to kind of like ministers and people around the world to assess what kind of experience these people had. And it was very clear that the people that had the medicine had a deeply religious revelatory experience. So this is a bit of a shock to the system, because usually the minister holds the power, not the person. So it's interesting looking at religions where there's a very tight ship of rules, and integrating psychedelics into some of these things, because certain things that are maybe strict, or that maybe they're not even true. You could say, like, God will discard me if I don't do this. Yeah, I know. I remember reading that. I was actually looking at psychedelics and the top things that people Google because I was just doing some research on stuff, and one of them was, are psychedelics haram, or haram I think it is, which is actually the kind of banned, like not religiously allowed. And then I was like, so I Googled the question, I was like, what is this? And it said that actually that's what it is considered within their own religion. And it's just interesting to kind of consider the impact of what would happen if certain psychedelics were put into certain religions, and how that might shape shift some of the rules and regulations around things, because it's a lot harder for dominance and control when people are becoming more empowered, when people are relying on their own intuitive wisdom and their own sense of what's right and wrong, rather than following a higher overarching authoritative power. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I just want to comment on a little bit of that. In terms of the context around depersonalization, derealization, I've experienced both of those, and they are dissociative states. And the derealization for me was experienced as my world felt like I was in a cartoon or an animation. It had more of a two-dimensional feel to it, my environment, than a three-dimensional feel. And it was like an animation rather than, I couldn't connect with it because it wasn't the world I was familiar with, and it wasn't there 24/7, but at times that would happen. And then the depersonalization, I would feel like I was a cartoon character in a normal world. So my identity of self was more like the two-dimensional being rather than the full human experience. So I became like a two-dimensional being, sometimes in a two-dimensional world. And it was really quite alarming, and I didn't notice and that went on for many months as well, but it wasn't there all the time. And so they were the three different dissociative states: the depersonalization, derealization, and then the sense of my spirit leaving my body, like I was going to pass out or die or something like that. Really quite alarming. And then another experience I had, which you just talked about, when I did my first full dose of 5-MeO and went and had a unity consciousness experience, I came back with that with a lot of guilt. And I thought that I was going to be punished by the gods because that I went and gate crashed heaven without an invitation. Like that was what I was raised Catholic, quite strict Catholic, you know. I went to church every Sunday for a while. I went to church every day. I was an altar boy. I was going to become a priest at one stage. So I was quite heavily indoctrinated with right and wrong, good and bad, God and the devil, punishment, and all that those kind of beliefs. And it was interesting that, you know, when I had this beautiful experience of being one with everything, when I came back, there was guilt that I did that without permission. And interestingly, like I've told my mother that I do psychedelics and ayahuasca, but I haven't told my father because he's very strict Catholic, and he would probably view somebody drinking some jungle concoction, would be like the devil's work. And so I deliberately don't tell my father about my psychedelic experiences because I think he would equate it with the dark side. But I do, I do get your point that that these psychedelics do open us up to being more open and that having a sense of internal authority rather than authority being handled down from the top down.
Yeah.
So we just take back some agency or autonomy in our spirituality by have an endogenous source that's catalyzed by the psychedelic experience.
Yeah, and when you were talking about that experience, one thing that Bianca Sieben talks about,
I know Bianca.
Oh, she does dissociative work in Brisbane, and so she works with bad trip people, but she has actually introduced this idea in the training I did with her about protector parts, and that this sometimes can be an issue for people, especially if they have something like, some sort of some need to kind of lock down a trauma. Like they'll do anything that they possibly can to avoid certain things because they have this underlying trauma. So they effectively have a functioning protector part. Yep. And for you too, it sounds like there possibly was a bit of a protector part there around like your dad and certain things you could and couldn't say to him, and you had to keep a gateway there at the door to make sure you didn't say certain things because maybe he might have got in trouble. And that was
I wasn't
as
safe
a kid.
if I said certain things as a kid. Yeah,
and so that protector part effectively was kind of like blasted open by that experience. You kind of took the psychedelic, you get blasted out into the universe and effectively blasted that protector part out the way kind of thing and didn't give it the chance to do its job. So in integration in that work, it's often a process of counselling that protector part, of even apologising to that protector part. I'm sorry that I did this. I'm sorry you didn't have the chance to protect me in the way that you like to protect me. And you've been a lot of value in my life and have served me well, and kind of going into a bit of a reconciliation space around that, because effectively that anxiety can sometimes be that the protector part feeling really violated. So I actually really found that to be a very supportive concept, and sometimes it could be valuable for people if they do have strong needs for certain protector parts in their life, to counsel with them before they engage in these experiences and say, look, just letting you know, we're going to engage in this experience. I'm going to let you, I'm going to let you still play a role, but at this point in time, I'm going to allow this frequency, or however you want to word it, to come through me, and we will talk after about how basically making it feel safe to the point that it can let go a little bit.
It's really opening my mind up to exponentially. My father was quite, physically violent. He was alcoholic and used to belt me quite a lot. So my protector, normally the father is the protector, was the one dishing out the abuse. And so I didn't have a protector. And so in my experience, and, you could see God as the father. And this is why I had trouble relating to my Catholic upbringing, because it's God the Father, but my father was a bit of a tyrant. So then I would equate the father with being a tyrant. So then I had trouble relating to the Catholic version of God. And so interestingly, when I had this amazing experience right there, I'm now going to be punished by God, by the Father, and that protector. So when you say the protector part, that's from IFS, is it, like internal family systems?
Well, yeah. I mean, she brought it up, but actually, I haven't. I do want to do studies in IFS. I haven't, but I have spoken to certain people about it, and I think they call them like the fire extinguishers, or that part of your psyche that come in and fix the problem. And IFS work, I think, is really valuable. But yeah, effectively, yes, that part of you
an internal
that would protect you. Yeah, that part of you that would protect you from your dad, that would support you to make the right decisions.
Yeah.
And if you weren't safe, do something.
Interesting, because when I did that experience, I felt very unsafe. Well, I felt safe enough to do it, but the full toad dose, it's not unlike dying. You don't know you're not dying if you do a full dose of 5-MeO-DMT. So I had to be, I had to summon up the courage to go where I've never been before, not knowing if I was going to come back or whatever. So I went into it feeling unsafe, but still wanting to do it because I'm very high in curiosity. And had I known about this protector part and had a conversation with it going in, I might have been better prepared and had less of a traumatic return. Going was wonderful. It was the return. Once I was back in my body, I was grateful for the experience, but within 5 minutes, there was this punishing voice saying, you had no business doing that. You went and played with the gods without an invitation, you've gate crashed, and so there was this kind of guilt complex and all that came with it.
It's interesting. I can see how that fits with what you're saying about the father and the religion, and then your real father, and then the protector part, and not gaining that consent before. I think consent is the main thing.
That's
consent beforehand.
I like that. Yeah, consent is really important.
But if you haven't gained consent, then reconciliation with that part afterwards, because sounds like it's almost that part coming through, being like, what was that? And you had no right for that, and no right to do that. So
and maybe even a little bit of guilt to that protector part for not protecting me, but I didn't know to do that. So guilt with self, for allowing myself to put myself in that vulnerable position, that I would even have that experience. And it was a fascinating conversation. This has actually been the most intelligent conversation I've ever had about psychedelics, and I've had many. I want to, if people wanted to find you or get a copy of your book, so in other words, people who I know a lot of people doing psychedelics, and I know a lot of people who would be looking for some help with integration. So if they wanted to find you, how would they go about finding you? Or if they wanted to pick up a copy of this psychedelic? I
have it at my website.
What's your website?
Which is healingpsychology.com.au, and people could just order it straight from the website. Or if they've got any questions, if people are wondering if they, sometimes when people have had a difficult experience and they just want to flag, would this be supportive for me? I'm happy if people, send me a bit of an email and explain what's going on, and then I can let them know whether, I think it'll be worthwhile engaging in further supportive work together.
So people can they book on your website, or they can book a call with you? They can book a call, or
they can't book a call either. It's got my number there.
Okay.
So
people can email you and let them know what's going on, and then you can have a conversation with them about whether you might be able to support them.
Or direct them to the right person or the.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, look, it's been a great conversation. Like I loved it. And it was very informative to myself. I even feel a little bit healed through that process of having that conversation. I really do. And I like your insights. I think you have wonderful maps and wonderful language for talking about this stuff that I can relate to through my own significant experience. And so, I do think that the integration phase is important. And I have people coming to me, for psychedelic integration. I don't promote that I do that. I'm basically a coach, but still people come to me for with these kind of issues. But now I know if there's someone solid and strong that I can refer them to and suggest they get a copy of your journal.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. I really loved being here and opening up to the endless possibilities of what this conversation could have been.
It can go anywhere when you open up those realms. Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure, Allie.
Great. Thank you so much.